Hi everyone, Jay here from Jade Productions, and today we'll be looking at another beginner's guide to Age of Sigmar. This time we're looking at our first death faction in the series. We're looking at the Flesh Eater Courts, a very popular, very easy to collect army that's got a few tricks and traps, but it is very easy to build, play, and collect with mastery at the extreme end. And it is very powerful and has been a consistent performing army for much of Age of Sigmar 2nd edition since its release. So, let's jump straight into it. With the Flesh Eater Courts, it's the usual, you see the things of crazy cannibal vampires or crazy cannibal people. Well, it's sort of both of those. Typically, your army is broken down into several factions, and there is pretty much as close to a knightly medieval order as you can get. You have your serfs down the bottom, which are your standard ghouls. Then you have your knights, and then you have your abhorrents, which are your kings and nobility. And separate from that, you have your royal beasts. So it's a very small army with very few things to collect. But it's one of those things of you tend to just be buying multiples of those boxes. And so, the real trick with the army is knowing what to buy, because, as we'll discuss in a little bit, it's kind of broken down in a way that is, every sort of type of unit has a special hero lieutenant of it, which has to be built using its particular box, but doing so will take away from the models you get in that box, and this is a very swarm-heavy faction, potentially, depending on how you want to play it, and it can kind of throw you off a bit. So it's one of those things, you got to plan out very much ahead of time what you're going to build out of what box, and it does mean you're going to probably end up buying one or two more boxes than you really want, or, as I'll suggest later, some kit bashing, which is something that you probably want to do. So, when you look through the army, the first thing that's going to strike you up is that it seems very aggressive. It's got the usual death sort of thing, which gives them an extra bit of protection, because most death armies tend to be very light on defense. They tend to have really only 5-up saves, 4-ups on their heroes, 6-ups on some of their really squishy stuff, and so you get that now. You get a 12-inch bubble of when your guys are wholly within 12 inches of a friendly Flesh Eater Courts hero. They get a 6-up to ignore damage. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's worth it just to talk to the Daughters of Cain players. And unfortunately, this is a faction that, as of making this, they have received a bit of a nerf in that there were ways to stack this and get the 6-up to ignore damage, and then get a 5-up to ignore damage, and then maybe some other ways to get ignores damage, to just make them a bit more defensible. This is going to affect them slightly in terms of power, but they are still a rather really good faction. And I would describe them as a slightly more aggressive steamrolling faction compared to the Daughters of Cain. They have a lot of parallels with the Daughters of Cain. The Daughters of Cain are very fast, very mobile, very good at being aggressive and killing. Now, they put out a lot of attacks with low AP and have a lot of ways to buff themselves, make themselves really, really terrifying in combat. But they also have a lot more defensive buffs. They also have a lot more tricks. Now, what the Flesh Eater Courts have is they have something very similar. They can be very mobile with their units. They can be very fast with their units, potentially. They're very aggressive because they don't have the defenses. Now, the difference here is that where the Daughters of Cain have the ability to buff up their defenses through numerous means, such as bladed bucklers, having hits turn into mortal wounds, when they get hit, to bounce mortal wounds back onto enemies, using blood shields from your go-to units, increasing the defensiveness, picking certain things that'll let the whole army, if they're within a certain range of certain units, re-roll their fanatical faith to ignore damage. None of that for the Death Eater Courts, Flesh Eater Courts. The Flesh Eater Courts are all about get in there, be as aggressive as possible. And now they do this through just moving fast and throwing out a lot of attacks. But they also then have something that is very much a staple to death armies, and this is what makes them a steamrolling army, in that I define steamrolling armies as basically a term for armies that are able to apply a lot of pressure psychologically and physically in the battle as it goes on. And other factions such as that are kind of steamrolling armies are things like ogres, where it's if you don't fight them, it's going to end up badly for you, and if you do fight them, it's going to end up badly for you. Because what can happen with the Flesh Eater Courts is they have the ability to go with attrition. They can play the attrition game, and that is how they suppress you and put pressure on you, and are able to really play the mind games with you, and do really well in every scenario, both at securing objectives and getting the points, as well as taking out opponents with high number of attacks. Now, it is an army where quantity is better than quality, but that's not to say you don't have some ways of really increasing that a lot. So, the summoning mechanics in your army, they're not as, say, powerful or as super widespread, and they do come with a cost compared to some other factions who, let's look at examples of some other death factions. If we look at the other 3 death factions that currently exist, the Nighthaunt, Legions of Nagash, and good old Ossiarch Bone Reapers, the Bone Daddies, each of those have ways of restoring models fairly easily, just as inbuilt abilities. Now, you have that, but to a lesser degree, and it's far more restrictive in how you do it. You need particular lieutenants from a particular kind of unit. For example, a Night Haunter Courtier, which is a special lieutenant version of the Crypt Horror, which is the really big horrors, the Crypt Ghouls, the really big ones, that are as pretty much ogre levels of stat. And he can roll, I think it's like 5 dice, 6 dice, and for every 5 up, he can restore 1 model to a particular horror unit. Or to any horror unit within, but he can only use 1 dice to restore 1 model. And that's him, for example. And then you have the Cryptghast Courtier, which is a lieutenant version of your standard Crypt Ghoul, and he does the same thing. He has more dice, and he does it on a 2+, and he can only restore models to Ghoul units. So you very much have your lieutenants synergizing with your units, and you're going to end up filling a lot of your other units. Not to mention, where the other death factions, they spend their command points, except for the Bone Daddies, they don't have command points. They spend their command points to get back dead units that have already been killed through their allegiance abilities and their summoning. You have the ability in Flesh Eater Courts across several of your primary HQs, and these are going to be essential ones, to spend command points in order to summon units on the flanks. And it's always a matter of picking which commander, because each kind of commander summons something different. So it makes building a list very interesting. So while you don't have a lot of options in this army, you have a lot of ways to play this army in terms of how you modify it and run things. So that's just a general introduction to that. So Deathless Courtiers combined with summoning and resurrection mechanics allows you to... That's how your defensive is. You attrition the enemy, essentially. So, then they've got Feeding Frenzy. And now this is the true sync of why this army is going to be command point hungry. Now, fortunately, as we'll go through later, a lot of your battalions are very easy to build. So, and you're going to have those units anyway, because once again, it is a limited unit roster. Feeding Frenzy is where you get the most out of your units. So, it's a command ability that you can use it immediately after any Flesh Eater Courts unit has piled in and made its attacks. And now, you don't have particularly great attacks, but you do have a lot of them. And you pick them, and they've got to be wholly within 12 inches of a Flesh Eater Courts hero, or 18 inches if that hero is your general. And then they get to pile in and attack again. Now this is the true power of your army. Not great attacks, but a lot of them. And I say not great attacks, but that's before you start buffing and applying the synergies of when characters are nearby, increasing the effectiveness of other things, and throwing in the other abilities that you're able to choose when you're making your army. This ability is really, really good, and so long as you've got command points, you can use it. Now, You can't use it on the same unit twice, but you have a lot of and you can use it across your army multiple times. It's not a once per combat phase, it's once per unit per combat phase. So you can use this and go straight for it. You can use it on your really big monsters, which monsters in Age of Sigmar tend to be really not having enough attacks but high damage. So you can and certain monsters, particularly the ones in this army, really struggle to hit with their more powerful attacks hitting on 4s. So with this, you'll be able to use it to get another chance to swing at it to try and get that massive damage off. Or when you have the ghouls, if you suspect those ghouls are going to disappear very quickly, you can select them to fight first. Say you've charged them, or they've been charged into something very terrifying, but your opponent wants to fight somewhere else first. You can take an advantage of that, and this is where the mind games come in with this faction, in that it's easy to play, hard to master. You have the ability to really pick fights, and you have the chance to really deal massive amounts of damage regardless of whose turn it is, so long as you have command points. So with this, you can turn the tide inside your opponent's combat phase pretty easily. And so Feeding Frenzy is the huge thing with your army. All your CP, all the ways that you can get it, is something that you want. You want it constantly. You want it on your heroes so they can make the most of their attacks, which are very decent attacks. You want it on your monster heroes and your monsters so that they can make the most of their hard-to-hit, high-damaging attacks. You want it on your ghoul, on your mini ghouls, so they can just throw out lots and lots of attacks to try and chew through enemy units before they all get melted away, so that you have to worry about resurrecting less of them. And you can use it to ensure that your heavy-hitting anvil units, such as the flayers and the horrors, are able to truly do the damage that you want them to do and make the most of. They have high attacks, they don't hit well, they wound well, but they got lots of damage and more wounds potentially output depending on which of the two it is. And so you use those to really get the most out of your army, because you don't have the endurance, so you need to hit, 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 hit. And that is where the pressure is. That's why I define them as a steamrolling army. You pretty much don't want to be fighting them, especially if they have command points, because if you fight them, they have a chance to turn it around on you. And if you don't fight them, well, then they can just summon units and resurrect units to try and control the battlefield, control the objectives, and outpoint you, because they are decently fast and able to move around pretty well with the right amount of buffs. The next big thing that the army has is its delusions, and so you have a bunch of delusions you can pick from. There's some really good ones in there, and these basically change the way your army plays. Now, the really cool thing that I love about, and as I said about Flesh Eater Courts, is that they're simple, but they have a lot of options that you can really tailor them to how you feel you want to be running it, and you can really play into your own lore that you build for your army, because they're insane. They have this delusion that they are noble knights doing whatever, and so the Court of Delusions is like, well, your army thinks they're a bunch of crusaders from going to retake Jerusalem, or retake that city that Sigmar lost. Or they might think that they're having a medieval tournament with the Grand Tournament delusion. And so all your heroes are trying to outperform each other to prove to the king that you know, they are the mightiest knights in the land. Or they might think that they are defending their realm from the vile invaders, but in reality, they think they're a bunch of noble, glorious knights riding Pegasus and dragons and being blessed with angel wings, when in fact they're deranged mutant cannibals that are literally just growling and snorting at each other while eating things, i.e. living things inside fortifications made of bones. And yeah, they're fun. But if that wasn't enough, you have these basic delusions. And then, like every other faction these days, you have your sub-factions, your grand courts. And now, unlike most factions where you can typically go to the grand courts and you can say, well, these are fantastic, why would I ever take any of the generic ones? The thing with the Flesh Eater Courts is I found in research and talking to people that they are pretty good, and I looked at their rules, right? There are some good generic court delusions. So you can use the generic stuff, And that will give you access to the generic command traits, the generic relics, which are very good, but they are not completely outshone by the Grand Courts. The Grand Courts are still very good, but they force, of course, some relics onto you and some command traits onto you that you might not particularly like or want, and certainly the Grand Courts definitely enjoy and skew into several particular playstyles, and that's where it's really cool about this, because as I said, you've got that limited unit roster, so each Grand Court supports a particular playstyle focusing on a particular kind of unit, where the generic ones, they're still viable, but they support a much more all-rounded build to what you want sort of thing. And so in terms of Grand Illusions, you've got some really cool ones. The best one is probably Crusading Army, which increases how fast you can run and charge by an inch. It's solid. But the best one is the Feast Day, which gets you a free Feeding Frenzy without spending a command point once per turn. And that's in both yours and your opponent's turn. So, that is a very good one, but there are other ones, and there are ways in which if you choose to go with generic Court of Delusions, you can actually be very tricksy with how you use it, in sort of a Caradron style, change your constitution as you play. There are certain abilities you can be as like, okay, I'm going to start with Crusading Army so that I can get up the board faster, and then you might use to have taken the command ability that actually lets you change your delusion and just go, okay, I've gotten up the board, but my opponent has brought a whole bunch of monsters that I need to deal with. They're running like a Thunder Lizard, or they're running Beast Claw Raiders, and they've got lots of monsters. So I'm going to switch now to the Royal Hunt and get myself reroll to hit and wound rolls of 1 against those monsters. So, yeah. There's ways to really manipulate your delusions in a pretty fun and satisfying way. So you're not tied in to any of the Grand Courts. They're not mandatory, but they give an amazing amount of customization. And so you've essentially got a Grand Court, the Morgant Court, which is all about increasing the effectiveness of the basic ghouls. And so this is the one you want to take if you want to have lots and lots and lots of ghouls. So it's an army of, you take your king, and you surround them with your serfs. Serfs is the keyword that is assigned to the basic crypt ghouls. And so you field masses of them. And crypt ghouls are pretty good. They have a fair amount of attacks. They can get a lot of attacks. You can buff them up to a lot of attacks. You can hand them out some other buffs. There's ways to increase them. They are pretty fragile, but so long as you've got a Cryptghast Courtier, you can resurrect them. And so you can have multiple Cryptghast Courtiers resurrecting them, and then they really benefit from being in the Morgant Grand Court. And it's really good, and you can, this particular Grand Court, the Morgant one, lets them re-roll hit rolls of 1. Well, it lets your courtiers re-roll, so your courtiers are your lieutenants, it lets them re-roll hit rolls of 1, so long as they're near your serfs. So it increases your character's effectiveness as its basic ability, so long as they're near your guys. It sounds a little odd, but then you realize that you have your courtiers hit really, really hard, like the Vargolf, which is probably mandatory. It's probably the most, of all the units I've looked in, it's probably the second most powerful, and it's one of 2 mandatory units I would say this army has. But then it's got ways, so you can summon more ghouls with its command ability, bring them back, so that's pretty good. And then, it's good. So it's the way, and it makes them ignore battle shock so they don't run away. So it's more about supporting those massive blobs. And so the ghouls themselves are 100 points for 10. So that's not particularly cheap for what you get, but that's not counting the synergies. But at the same time, your ghouls are 360 points for a max unit of 40. That discount that you get is actually pretty good. And so you can bring them in 200 point lots for 20 of them, or you can bring them in 40 man lots. They're even good MSU style because they're only 100 points, just to chuck in 10 man unit squads, just hold backlines. So they're particularly good, but we'll get more bound down to them in a minute. So, you got the Morgant Court, which is all about them. You got the Hollowmorn, which is all about your courtiers and knights. So this is one where, do you like horrors? Do you like flayers? Okay, this is the court for you. This is one where they get basically, they don't hit as well, but there's ways to mitigate that with having the appropriate synergies that those particular units have. But then they wound pretty well, but you don't have a lot of ways to reroll wounds. So Hollowmorn gives you the way to make the damage of these much more reliable, and it also lets you make your Hollowmorn units much more faster. So it's very much a build a Death Star of big horror units and Flayer units for nice big multi-wound, multi-damage units that act as massive anvils to try and get up the board extremely fast and smash your way through the opponent's lines, particularly quickly. And so they are pretty good. I'm not particularly a fan of Hollowmorn's command trait and artifact, but its main abilities are good for supporting, its command ability and trait are good for supporting that particular kind of play. So if you really like the little guys, there's one for that. If you like the big guys, there's one for that. If you like to go fast, if you like the idea of these swarm of crazy flesh-eater courts just going as fast as possible across the battlefield, you can go for the Blisterkin. Now the Blisterskin are pretty much what I would call the all-rounders of the four major grand courts looking at them. All their units gain an additional 2 inches of movement, which is pretty much the best buff in the history of Age of Sigmar. Because movement is very important in this game. And an additional 2 inches of movement is very important for positioning, making sure you're getting close enough to get the charge off, snagging that objective, making sure you got enough guys in range. So it's a very, very good ability. It's very generic and very good. And then Blisterkin has a command ability that's, okay, it supports your flying unit, so it's very mobile. It's the mobility option. But then you reach its command trait and its artifact. And it's, okay, so now we're going to protect your character better with your artifact by giving them -1 hit rolls made against missile weapons, because you don't have any shooting, so shooting is a real weakness of yours. So you have to get into melee with them. They don't, potentially. So shooting armors can be your weakness. And so they say, okay, we're going to let you go with that, and that's going to help you out there. And then they give you the command trait Hellish Orator, which is very good. It's on a 4+, so long as your general's on the battlefield, you get a CP. Okay, so you have a way to get CP, you have a way to get more maneuverability, you can increase the mobility of your flying units, and you get the ability to protect your crucial characters better. So it's the all-rounder. You could argue that's definitely the mobility option, but I think that combined with across all of its traits, it is typically the most well-rounded of all of them. And so the Blisterskin is definitely a grand court where if you can't decide on your general delusions, or if you are building battalions and you're like, I feel like I'm building something that's all-rounded as an army list, but I don't feel like playing with the generic stuff, I'm going to go and use Blisterskin. Now, the last one is the Gristlegore. Now, Gristlegore, unlike the other ones, unlike the 3 grand courts that we've just covered, where you don't have to build into them. You can skew into them slightly, but they'll work with just about any build. Because, once again, you're probably going to be including certain things unless you're really spamming. And so they have the option to build into them, but you don't need to. And so if you build an all-round army of just grabbing what you think is cool, grabbing a little bit of everything, you'll be able to just go in one game and say, okay, I'm going to be Blisterskin today, and then you know, you might get bored of that and go, okay, I'm going to be Hollowmorn instead. And it'll work with what you've got. To an extent. So you don't have to super build into, like, Hollowmorn is like, I'm just going to buy horrors. Nothing but horrors. Gristlegore is a bit different. This is one you have to build into, and the reason you have to build into it is to get the most out of it is you need to buy very expensive models. Now, it's also the way in which you can It's not the cheapest way to do this army, but it's also the way in which you can get away with painting the least amount of models. Because Gristlegore is all about monsters, monsters, and monsters. Its ability, monsters, 6s to hit. For heroes and monsters, score 2 hits instead of 1. Cool. You don't have a lot of attacks on your monsters, so this will help. Then you get your command ability. You get a hero or Gristlegore monster that's not yet fought and is slain, wholly within 12 inches, and you get to die. You get to pile in and fight before you die. Sweet. Making the most out of those monsters before they go. Particularly good with Terrorgeist as they explode. You command trait. Cool. You it's okay. And then you get your Gurish Morshard, your relic. So there are ways to do this, but and the important thing is Gristlegore makes your Royal Terrorgeists and your Royal Zombie Dragons battle line. So you can get away with having an army of nothing but Zombie Dragons and Terrorgeists. Because you can get your Ghoul Kings on Zombie Dragons, you can get your Ghoul Kings on Royal Terrorgeists, and then with this, you get your Terrorgeists. So you can literally make a minimum size army out of 4 units. You probably end up having about 5, because they're like 3, 6, 9, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 1700 points just from having 5 monsters. So, you know, you're going to end up having 5 to 6 monsters. So it's 5 to 6 models in your list. So there's definitely that. Yeah. So, and so you really got to build into them. So going forward, as I flick through the book, they've got some nice command traits, pretty solid. Once again, overall, the army is very versatile, and you'll see, you don't have a lot of units, but you have a lot of rules. Your royalty all have different command traits, your nobility, which are all your courtiers, your lieutenants all have different command traits, and they can be very good. You have units, you have command traits that make you more killy, you have command traits that boost your magic, you have command traits that can play on enemy bravery, you have command traits that let you, completely delusional is one of my favorites here, which lets you actually change up your delusions if you're running with the generic delusions. Now, you have to be running with the generic delusions because you are stuck with the delusion you have from the Grand Courts, and you're stuck with a specific command trait, so you can't, unfortunately. But that is something that this army has. They make up for lack of models with a high amount of rules, and so that's why they're easy to play, hard to master, because while they're basic on the surface, once you start adding on rule after rule after rule after rule, you got to keep on top of that and stay on it, and really use the most of that to make your army go from what it currently is to a solid damage dealing army that's nice and aggressive, to how it performed so far across Age of Sigmar 2.0 as a very well-renowned, high-tier, high-performance army, even at tournaments. And now, some things about this is, I definitely, just a quick note that I've got here in my notes, is the nobility command traits. Now, don't dismiss those. I did on my first read-through of this book, and I pretty much regret that, because I see now that they're really good. Because there's some gems in there that I really liked, and I looked around, and I made some builds, and I really came to like the courtier ones really a lot. My particular favorite was definitely Dark Acolyte and Cruel Taskmaster. So yeah, that was so don't underestimate those ones. And now, you might think, well, I don't particularly want to take those as any of those courtiers as my general. Well, the Vargolf definitely benefits from the close combat based ones. And your abhorrents are pretty good by themselves. They don't need extra stuff to make, to make them decent. They're already very good. You know, they have spells, they have some of the best attacks in the army, they have a lot of attacks, they're pretty efficient at 3s and 3s, they have rend, and they heal. They don't need to go nuts on in terms of those. And then, you know, there are reasons to make the the Night Haunter, Courtier your general, and that's because he makes, Horror's battle line, so you have that one knight leading all your other knights. So there's that in particular. So they're very durable and versatile in that way. So just keep that in mind. Don't dismiss those like I did initially. They're definitely better than they first seem, and making the most of your courtiers rather than making the most of your abhorrents is actually, I feel, the better way to go with this army. And then you've got a whole bunch of artifacts, once again, split into 2 separate things for abhorrents and courtiers. Once again, you look at the abhorrents first, because typically it's, oh yeah, I've got this nice vampire lord leading them all. Like, cool. There's a lot of cool stuff in here for him, but the noble heirlooms for the courtiers are also fairly decent. They're not fantastic. Definitely the abhorrence treasures are better, but the noble ones, particularly a favorite one of mine is the Medal of Madness and the Flayed Pennant, definitely synergize well with certain builds, and are just general nice little buffs that you can have. Those 2 are very general in what they give, so they're pretty good in that regard. The Flayed Pennant is a wholly within 12 inches aura of reroll charge rolls for all Flesh Eater Court units. That's great. Medal of Madness. Once per battle round, your courtier can use one of the 3 generic command abilities without spending a command point. Okay, those command abilities don't benefit me much, but the Inspiring Presence and the re-roll hit rolls of 1 in melee, those are good, but it's the Inspiring Presence that immediately sticks out in my mind. If you're not bringing any of the things that make you immune to battle shock, you don't want to be spending CP to keep your horrors and your ghouls in the fight. You need them to stay, and instead of trying to resurrect them, it's easier if they just don't die at all and don't run away. So with that, even if you get hammered and they're looking, you can just go, okay, I don't have to spend a CP to do this. I still have that CP that I can use on a feeding frenzy without holding back, and I don't need to worry because I do have my backup plan so long as my courtier with the Medal of Madness is nearby to Inspiring Presence them. So, very cool on that. And now, unlike certain factions which will remain nameless, you actually have mount traits. Stupid Seraphon. So here your mount traits are divided into your Royal Zombie Dragon and your Royal Terrorgeist. Now, they can only be given to a hero mounted on one of those. So it's got to be an abhorrent Ghoul King on a Zombie Dragon, or an abhorrent Ghoul King on a Terrorgeist. These are very good, solid monsters that, with the addition of these traits are actually ridiculous in my opinion. Some of them are just stupidly powerful. The horribly resilient to heal a flat 3 wounds every turn is like just bloody hell, piss off. That's ridiculously strong. The exploding for the 3 mortal wounds, sure. The Razor Clawed for 2 rend, that one's not, well, for an additional 2 rend. That was not so great. The Deathly Fast can run and shoot. Well, hello. But, you know, Gruesome Bites. Reroll your hit rolls with your Fanged Maw. Oh, you mean the Fanged Maw that deals a ridiculous amount of damage and hits on 4s, and the 4s being the only downside of that weapon. Oh, well, sure, I'll just make that, you know, super more reliable and put every other monster in the universe to shame. So, yeah, sure, why not? Sorry, I don't mean to be salty, but you have ridiculously good mount traits in this army. Your mount traits are great. And of course, you can have multiples so long as you bring battalions. So, the zombie dragon is not as good. It's not as good, but it's still got some good ones. Still got horribly resilient, baleful breath, deathly fast, necrotic fangs, which is not as good as the gruesome bite, and the death from the skies, which is like I'm a deep strike. First turn, you just your dragon can appear anywhere on the board at the end of the first movement phase. So you just drop him down there, 9 inches away. Declare that charge while the rest of your army has hopefully run up behind him. And are about ready to charge on in as well. This is an army that can do first turn charges. Now, so you got particularly, like I said, it's a lot of rules. And then on top of that, you've got your Law of Madness spells. And now, most of your abhorrents, all of your abhorrents actually, are wizards. So there's that. They each have somewhat unique spells, each of them, so be aware of that. And then there's ways to make your courtiers wizards with certain things, but they won't have it most of the time unless you're actively building towards that. And then you've got some decent spells. Your spells aren't as fantastic from your lore. Deranged Transformation is probably one of the better ones, along with Monstrous Vigor if you're bringing monsters or have a guy mounted on a monster. Monstrous Vigor is a good one if you have that killer Terrorgeist, Ghoul King on Terrorgeist, who's just been loaded up for combat. You put all the mount traits on him, you just got him ready to roll for combat. He's just like your massive hammer to smash through your opponent's lines. Well, he just, you give him Monstrous Vigor for his spell, he can cast that. It's really easy to cast on a 5-up. Just ignore his damage bracket. Just ignore it. It doesn't even matter. Your monsters are fantastic. It's the only game. Anyway, so, and then you have a few other things that are pretty good. Spectral Host is particularly good. It's slightly harder to cast, but it's a nice support power that you are able to use it to increase how fast your units can go. So you can give a unit fly, and if they already have fly, they can run and charge. So it's very good with flayers. But it's also pretty good if you have a bunch of zombie dragons and terrorgeists around, so they can run and charge. And then you have some damage dealing spells, and the damage dealing spells they vary from okay to sort of meh. I think Miasmal Shroud, while it has potential, is probably the worst one. Probably Blood Feast before it, but actually no, I still want to say I look at Blood Feast and I'm like, Miasmal Shroud is still worse. And then you have Endless Spells. Now, there is a thing, Endless Spells are always slightly reliable. These ones, unreliable. These ones aren't bound. They're, so they can be sort of done with that. The Predatory one is not one you particularly want to use. The Corpse Mare Stampede. But your other ones, which aren't particularly going to backfire on you too hard, are very good. A little expensive, your Endless Spells. Like the Skaven, good Endless Spells, or mostly good Endless Spells. Actually, no, the Skaven only have one good Endless Spell. But you have 2 very good Endless Spells out of the 3. The Chalice of Usharan, which helps you do what you want to do. When stuff dies nearby it, it basically can heal stuff at the end of the turn for each 4+. It's basically, when things, you count up a number of models that are slain within 12 inches of the Endless Spell. So, for example, you charge some ghouls in, they kill some stuff, and then they lose some back. If they are all within 12, or if all those models that died within 12 inches, you get that many, basically count that number next to it. I typically put a dice or something, counting the number. And say you get like 12 models died near it. Okay, at the end of each turn, So, yours and your opponent's, you roll a number of dice equal to that count. So, in our example, 12. And for each 4+, you heal 1 wound or return a model with a wound's characteristic of 1 to any Flesh Eater Court units nearby. Okay. So, you get rewarded for killing and dying, the 2 guaranteed things that are going to happen in a Flesh Eater Court's army, because you're made of paper, and you can hit surprisingly hard. Actually, you hit very hard. So, sweet. And then the Cadaverous Barricade is just a very good controlling spell. It's a nice wall you can pop up. It's really trolly. It's definitely interesting. And then that's it. So that's a lot of rules that you've got. It's a very interesting. So the basic premise to take away is you don't have a lot of units to pick from, but you have a lot of rules. And these rules can really help you go towards a particular different way in which you want to approach the Flesh Eater Courts. You like wizards, you got ways to build for lots of wizards. You like crypt horrors, go for crypt horror builds. You like ghoul builds, you can flood the field in an endless tide of ghouls. You like flayers, you can do that. You like monsters, you can do that. You can do nothing but a monster mash. So they've got a really good way. They've got lots of rules that help cover their weaknesses and lots of rules that help them exemplify their weaknesses. The only thing that they don't have are particularly rules to help their defensiveness and their survivability. They're typically relying on their ability to replenish units, their ability to typically be able to summon stuff, and they're typically relying on the ability to basically try and ignore damage on that 6-up, which is not very reliable, but it's something. But those 3 factors combined, the summoning, the restoring models, and the ignoring damage, are all reliant on your characters. And this is the theme with Death Armies. Death Armies require your characters to be alive, to function properly. So that is the number one thing. And you'll learn this when you go to play it, is your opponent is immediately going to try and strike down those characters if he can. So the best solution is to try and manipulate their auras and abilities and their ranges as best you can so as to hide them. I've played a few games where it's been quite annoying to have to deal with it, as essentially it's against armies that don't have a whole lot of mobility. The Flesh Eater Courts can really screen and block out areas, and you don't want to come near one of their blobs because they have a lot of attacks, and that's really good because, you know, you will fail enough 4-up saves, and 4-up save is like a really good heavy armor save in Age of Sigmar. So 3 attacks, force and 4s, you're giving them extra attacks, like and any other synergy buffs you want to put on them. It's like Daughters of Cain all over again. You just churn through them with sheer number of dice rolls. You just throw buckets of dice at them until they go away. So you don't want to go near those. And so that helps them really screen out. And then you just have your characters at just the right positioning. This is why positioning is really important in Age of Sigmar. As I continue to drill in every video, positioning is key, because you have them just within range to do their things and make sure that you're not going to get out of range, that no one can punk you, no one can get behind you, no one can try and force their way in to take you out. You're close enough to get defensive buffs from Lookout Sir, but not far enough away that you're going to get overrun into by something that's a particularly killer unit. So manipulating that and learning that is particularly good. And this game that I played was one of several. The opponent was able to keep his Flesh Eaters, because I was running Seraph on that particular day. He was able to keep his Flesh Eaters, able to pretty much hide them for pretty much the entire game. And what happened is the Horrors, Flayers, and Terrorgeist, Abominate King on Terrorgeist, and the 2 other Ghoul units were able to successfully screen just with their sheer numbers and restoration ability, and the summoning of additional units, like summoning Vargolf, summoning more guys on all these different flanks around me, meant it that you didn't have time to deal with those characters because you couldn't get close to those characters, because they just hid in the backfield, and without the mobility to get there, because you can position them in such a way that you blow up, you block off the 9 inches that required for Deep Strike when you get deployed in the territories, then it it's very good. So, they also, you need to keep them alive. That said, you're able to do that fairly easy, as I just said, like that player did, because you're able to control the field pretty well, because you have high number of bodies, and you have a fair amount of mobility and movement gimmicks. Now, we'll talk about the models and the units real briefly, but there's not a lot that we need to talk about here, because what you see on their war scrolls is pretty much what you get. They're rules that really make them interesting and versatile, and a lot of their rules are all, their allegiance abilities, all the things in their battle tome we've covered and given you a general indication of some of the cool things you can do and to look out for. When it comes to these guys, it is literally a case of you can just buy them, and as they are on their war scroll, that's as they are. You don't need to worry about extra equipment options. You don't need to worry about what weapon you need to give them. None of that. What you need to worry about when it comes to collecting and building this army is what models you're going to try and build out of what kits, because they share kits a lot of the time. They're multi-model, they're multi-build kits, dual-build kits. Like the Abhorrent Ghoul King on Terrorgeist, Zombie Dragon, and then your generic ones. So that kit, for example, will let you build either an Abhorrent Ghoul King on Terrorgeist, it'll let you build an Abhorrent Ghoul King on Zombie Dragon, or it'll let you build a Royal Terrorgeist or Royal Zombie Dragon, plus a regular Abhorrent Ghoul King. So, that's the thing. And now, it's very easy to get this army, thanks to the Get Starting box, which gives you a nice selection, and gets you 2 dragons right off the bat, one of which you can have Abhorrent Ghoul King in, and gets you another one with Abhorrent Ghoul King on foot and a regular Terrorgeist or a Zombie Dragon. But that's the thing about this army. You've got to pick how you're going to build each kit very carefully, and it's more important when it comes to the courtiers. So, your Abhorrent Ghoul Kings are your primary wizards. They all have fantastic spells. They all summon something different, which is something you need to keep in mind. So, that's something you very much need to keep in mind when you're list building. But when it comes to collecting and building them, it's not something that you need to worry about a whole lot unless you really want to go out and buy extra things. Fortunately, what they summon is on their war scrolls, so you can immediately look at their war scrolls and go, so this guy, he summons knights. So the Zombie King, the Abhorrent Ghoul King on Zombie Dragon, he summons Vargolfs. Okay, I'm going to go get a Vargolf solely for summoning. I was going to get a Vargolf anyway, now I'm going to get 2. So, that's the thing about this army. What you buy and build will very much affect what you buy and build next. So, other than that, you don't have to worry about equipment options, fortunately. And you don't have to worry about banners, you don't have to worry about musicians, you don't have to worry about, do I have the correct loadouts? Have I built these correctly according to what it says on the war scroll and what is a legal build option? None of that. They are very easy because of that. What you see on the war scroll is what you get. It's just, you got to be aware of certain units, like your characters, are very much, okay, to have this in a list and work, I'm going to have to buy this next. The only thing that doesn't have this is the Abhorrent Archregent, because you want this no matter what kind of army you're building. It is a more powerful Abhorrent Ghoul King that is much more expensive in terms of points cost, but can actually be purchased separately now. It's now available separately, thank crying out loud. And it is fantastic, because it gives you the ability to... it gives you some versatile summoning. He has a fantastic spell, which is better than the regular Abhorrent Ghoul King spell. It's basically a buffed up version. And he has more attacks, and he can do a lot more, and he's just as painful to get rid of as the regular Ghoul King with the regeneration, because you regenerate a lot in this army. That is a thing, and don't forget that. That's something I've seen people do. They forget about the regeneration, and then 3 turns later, oh no! So, that's something to keep in mind. All your units, but the ghouls, regenerate. Okay? They all regenerate differently, but they all regenerate. And now, on a quick side note about the abhorrents, we talked briefly before just about the spell lore and how it's okay to decent with some good stuff in here. The problem is you don't exactly have a lot of spell casting, so to get a lot of spells out, you have to take multiple abhorrents or invest in making courtiers wizards. But the thing is, the abhorrents, their basic spells that come on their war scrolls, are pretty much the better spells. Like the spell that the Abhorrent Ghoul King on Terrorgeist has, his unique spell gives him a 5-up to ignore damage, which used to be you could stack that with the regular Deathless Minions one, but now this one it overrides it because of the new FAQs. Well, because of the new General Handbook. So that's great. That increases his survivability. So now he's got a 4-up, 5-up. Cool. That's probably better than any of the other base spells he's going to cast. Abhorrent Ghoul King on Zombie Dragon. Sweet. His unique spell, 10-inch bubble of Holy Within reroll to wound rolls for all flesh eaters. Fantastic. Fantastic spell. The Abhorrent Ghoul King. Cast that. Give a nearby unit an extra attack. Amazing. Abhorrent Archregent, same thing, but gives the unit an extra D3 attacks. And as I said, this is an army where quantity of attacks beats quality. Because you can get lots of rerolls, you can't get lots of pluses to hit in this army. So, extra attacks with rerolls can be absolutely insane. You can put the highest attack count per model units, such as Witch Elves fully buffed up, to shame with just one spell from an Abhorrent Archregent and a lucky D3 roll. Because you can go up to 3 attacks, and you can end up at 4 attacks on equal footing with a fully buffed up unit of Witch Elves, and then you can then, on a good one, you're going up to 6 attacks per model in a large horde that is fully buffed up. And that's not accounting any rerolls that you put on them on top of that. So, I think you're getting the point here. Now, you might be thinking you have to buy a lot of ghouls. Fortunately, when it comes to your troops, your main battle line is only ghouls, unless you are skewing into something like Gristlegore, or you make a Crypt Haunter Courtier your general. Or Crypt Flayers can be battle line if you make a Crypt Infernal Courtier, which is their lieutenant version, as your general as well. So, there's ways to do that. Fortunately, you don't need a lot of them. They're good in units of 20. They're murderous in anything more than that. If you field lots of them, well, that's a lot of models. But you don't have to. This army works just as well with just a few units of 10 and a few units of 20 mixed in. You can do the 20 to 10 ratio, so 1 unit of 20, 2 units of 10. You can get away with not buying any extras after buying some to get starting boxes. You can buy lots of these and have huge units of them. 3 huge units of 40 is absolutely nightmarish, especially when you support them. That's most of your army, but that can be nightmarish as far as hordes go. So Crypt Ghouls, you don't have to buy a lot of them. So this army can be simple to paint if you want. You don't have to buy shit tons of them. You might buy 1 extra box, 2 extra boxes, depending on how much you think you're going to be summoning them. So, there is that. Now, the maximum you can summon them in is units of 20, so a single extra box. So you might, and because you die real easy, you might decide, well, I'm not going to summon a whole bunch of stuff and go out and buy a whole bunch of extra stuff just so I have things to summon and spam so that I get 400, 500 points of extra models on top of my opponent just as a giant middle finger to him. I'm just going to recycle my dead models through the summoning so that I have to buy and paint less stuff. That's a perfectly reasonable way to go, and the army can still function with lists built to do that. Then, getting back on topic, we have our courtiers, who are your other leaders. So, where your abhorrents are your big wizardy meat sticks that can deal a lot of damage. They ride your dragons, they lead your army, they have fantastic spells, they do their summoning abilities. They specifically have the summoning abilities for command points. The courtiers provide the regeneration. So, your units are basically broken down into, as I said, you have these lieutenants. Now, the thing is, I would recommend, because the Crypt Infernal Courtier and Crypt Haunter Courtier are built from the same box, the Crypt Horror / Flayer box. They're essentially, you put extra parts on them to make them those, and you essentially have to convert them up a bit. So you got some ways to approach it. You can either convert them up from those bits, or get a proxy and convert it up, go wild with some stuff, however you want to do it. Make sure they're on the right base size and the right sort of size, I guess. However you want to do it, but get those. So, for example, you might buy one box, and this is after you've bought a whole bunch of Crypt Horrors and whatever you want to get, and you might get one box, and you might build, because you like horrors more, you might build two Crypt Haunter Courtiers and one Infernal Courtier. Or, if you're planning a much more, I'm going to just field one unit of Crypt Horrors, so I only want one Crypt Haunter Courtier, but then I'm going to be fielding two Crypt Flayer units that I bought in separate boxes on the flanks, and I want characters to support them. Okay, I'm going to use another box to build one Crypt Haunter and two Crypt Infernals. So that is how it works, and it's good to try and make the most out of every model in the box, because Games Workshop loves to overcharge you. No point in wasting plastic, I believe. So you can plan them out, and then of course you might only want one or two. So of course then you've got conversion fodder. The problem is you can't use the leftovers in Age of Sigmar, so you can't buy you can't buy two boxes and then be like, okay, I'm going to build... Well, you can do this. It's just not recommended. Because what you do is you get two boxes of Crypt Horrors. The first box of Crypt Horrors, you build with 3 models. Then in the second box, you build 2 regular Crypt Horrors and a Crypt Haunter to support them. Cool. If you try to field that as a 5-man squad of Crypt Horrors, you have to pay the points as if you were fielding 6 of them. So you're actually kind of selling yourself short. And this is why I would prefer a bit more... this is where Age of Sigmar is both balanced and unbalanced. If you bring a underpowered unit, you're still paying the same of it. And sure, it's not... It sucks that it's not granular. That you can't be like, okay, I start with 3 units and then I can, for another 15, I'll buy this and then I'll buy another this. Sure, that sucks, but Age of Sigmar balances that out with armies are very easy to build because you very much know, okay, that is that. So this is this. It comes in blocks of this and this. I don't need to worry about finagling my list as much as possible. There's probably going to be points left over to do stuff. Accept it. Your opponent's going to be in the same boat. So, it makes army building easier, but it can also frustrate when it comes to armies like Flesh Eaters who have this problem with their lieutenants being built out of the same kit and boxes as their basic units. And you'll feel this particularly when you try to build Cryptghast Courtiers, because Cryptghast Courtiers are the ghoul champions. And they are built out of the same box of ghouls. And ghouls come in boxes of 20. Or, they come in units, they come in 10 when you buy them in the Get Starting box. Now, you don't want to be sacrificing any one of those. You don't want to be paying for 20 and fielding 19. You just don't want that. So, my advice, when it comes to Cryptghast Courtiers, is to actually go and get the Hollowmorn Duke Crackmarrow kit from Warhammer Underworlds. Now, most Warhammer Underworlds are pretty average, mediocre, shit units. They're absolute. I'll say it, they're absolute trash most of the time. Now, funnily enough, this one's actually an exception to the rule. Duke Crackmarrow and his goons are actually decent. Yeah, it's surprising. They're actually decent, but they make excellent conversion fodder, in my opinion. So you can just proxy them as Cryptghast Courtiers. If you buy them, boom, that's 5 Cryptghast Courtiers you got that you can just say, yep, they're Cryptghast Courtiers. Just ensure that they're mounted on a 32mm base, which I'm pretty sure that's what they come on. Anyway, so you just be like that. Okay, yep, they're proxying for that, or just do a little bit of conversion with some spare parts, and done. 5 Cryptghast Courtiers. Done. Easy. Nice and easy. Rather than have to, okay, I'm going to buy a box of 20 ghouls now, then I'm going to make one of them a Ghast Courtier, and I'm going to buy another box, and now I need to go out and maybe go to a bit store and get one singular ghoul to make sure I actually have 2 units of 40, because model count matters when it comes to hordes. Model count matters, because hordes, such as ghouls, every model counts, because at certain thresholds of certain models, they receive bonuses. So, keep that in mind when it comes to building. Secondly, next on our list of things to do is Varghulf Courtiers. Buy one. So, where the Cryptghast heals your ghouls, yes, he heals your ghouls, and the Haunter and the Infernal heal the Horrors and Flayers, respectively. The Varghulf, he heals both. Well, he heals all 3. To say that correctly, he heals all 3. On top of that, he gets extra damage when because of his Feed on Dark Magic ability, and he hits very hard. He's fast, he can heal everything, and he can be summoned, and there are many damage buffs that you can put on him in the relics section, and he can go ham. So, he's not super durable, but he can hit very hard. So he is fantastic, and he is mandatory because he is versatile. Have at least one for summoning. There's no Flesh Eater Courts player that hasn't discussed with me. Get one, and I don't disagree. Always have one. Now, here's the thing. The only Varghulf Courtier model is really old and really bad, in my opinion. I don't like the model. So, that's an opportunity to go on and show the delusions and express the creativity that this faction really encourages. Because this is an army that's great for conversions, because you have so few models that you can just go out and, okay, I'll strap some armor plates to that, get some Bretonnian parts, get some of that, you know, get some Sigmarine parts, maybe, you know, give them hammers and stuff, you know, there's all sorts of things you can do to play into whatever delusion you set up for them in their narrative. There's really cool conversions out there. The Varghulf is an excuse to go, okay, I'm going to go get some of these really cool monsters from some of these third parties and use that. Or I'm going to make my own Varghulf out of all these spare parts. I'm going to use some Infernal parts. I'm going to use some Horror parts. I'm going to use some Ghoul parts. I'm going to use some parts from the Ghoul Kings. Just go ham and use that. Just make sure you mount it on the right base size as per everything. So, that is your courtiers, and these are very important to have, and you'll probably want 2 of each, minimum. You'll never probably use all of them in a single battle, but it's good to have them because they can help you skew your thing. This is an army where you can buy a bunch of stuff and you'll be able to run just about anything over time. Like, with about 3,000 points, just purchasing a few of everything, you can actually pretty much build and run any kind of list except for the Gristle Gore. That's one you have to be like, okay, I'm just gonna buy monster. You know, no, that one's not a... That one's one you have to build into. But if you just buy a bunch of stuff, you can really just... You're stuck with a good army that you can play a dozen different ways so that you don't get bored of it quickly. And that's where I think the strength of this army really is, and I really love them for that. And finally, we talk about the Crypt Horrors, your Knights, and your Knight units, your Crypt Horrors, your Crypt Flayers. These are your Sledgehammers. They're both built out of the same box, as I said before. They're both nice 4 wound, 5 up save, 2 to 3 attack units. So the Crypt Flayers are fast, fly, and have shooting, screaming attacks that deal mortal wounds based on enemy bravery. So they're okay. They're harassers, they're mobile, they can get places, they can be summoned. You feel them in big blocks, you can get a lot of mortal wounds off because they have an ability that when they score 6s to wound, they deal 1 mortal wound in addition. Or is it 6s to hit? Where is it? Where is it? I can't see it. I'm pretty sure it's 6s to hit for them. But I'm running out of time on this. I've already gone over time. So we'll breeze through the rest of this and what you need to know. Crypt Horrors, they run. They're a bit more beefy. They get supported, of course. You know, they're slower, but they're Sledgehammers. Both of them get to reroll while they're near your Abhorrent units. And Crypt Horrors just deal flat out more damage when they roll successfully. So they're nice. Then, of course, you got your monsters. Not much to say on them. You've got your scenery piece, which is pretty trash with the exception of it lets you do summoning for free. So you basically are just going to use that first turn and then move away from it. And then your battalions. Fortunately, your battalions, as I said with this army, really easy to build. They have some nice buffs. Some of my particular ones are Attendants of the Court, the Dead Watch, and the Abattoir. The Ghoul Patrol is also pretty nice. So they're all very easy to build. They're all reasonably costed. Their abilities that they give are, you know, pretty good. They're nice and easy. And you can build into them. You're probably going to end up with multiples of them anyway, because you're going to have these units already in your army. You're already going to have bought them, so it's nice and easy to build these during list building. And of course, they'll get you extra artifacts and extra mount traits, so that's nice. And that's it. So that's where we go on that. Now, I have gone overtime on this video. I'm definitely sorry for that. But this is an army that, while they're simple on the surface, there's more to them than that. And they're really good, really strong, and they can provide a lot of versatility and fun out of them. But they can be tricksy in terms of just building. So, keep that in mind. When you go to invest in these, just carefully plan out what you're going to get. And, once you have just about one of everything, a couple of everything, which is kind of what you want, you're going to have a very solid army that you can play over and over again in a number of different ways. And they can be very, very, very competitive. So, to not drag this out any longer, I have been Jay from Jade Productions. Thank you for listening to this Beginner's Guide to Age of Sigmar for Flesh Eater's Court, and I will see you next time.